This video is for senior high history. We are covering the highlights from pages 424 to 430. So we're looking at the Vietnam War now. On page 424, find the name Ho Chi Minh and highlight that he was a Vietnamese communist. And his intention here was controlling all of Indochina. So this is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And sadly, this communist was bolstered by the Tehran Conference, and that's when Roosevelt and Stalin agreed not to let the French regain control of the region. So that was kind of the birth of communism in this area. On the second column, highlight the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Highlight this was a supply trail and that it traveled through Cambodia. You want to know about that? Alright, and then the Gulf of Tonkin Deceit. And this was a whole messed up affair in which 2 U.S. destroyers were allegedly, notice the word allegedly there, it means supposedly, that's the story that's told. They were allegedly fired upon by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. United States Naval and Air Force forces retaliated by sinking 2 of the North Vietnamese vessels and bombing bases in North Vietnam. So a lot of people believe, and evidence seems to point to, that this incident was set up by the U.S. government, and that it wasn't the North Vietnamese that torpedoed the boats, but that it was staged and that it was set up to give an excuse to attack, which is unfortunate given the fact that the battle was intentionally started, but the soldiers and the generals who became involved were not allowed to actually fight to win the war. So on page 425, highlight the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Highlight that it provided the legal justification for U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam conflict. And now we call it the Vietnam War, but technically it was not a war because war was never officially declared by Congress. And you have the information there, and Admiral James Stockdale, an eyewitness to the Gulf of Tonkin, insisted that the entire incident was fabricated for unconstitutional war-making powers. So an eyewitness there saying that it was all kind of set up. So it was a no-win war. And Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina kind of hit the nail on the head. He addressed the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, and he said, "Mr. Secretary, I think it is a statement of placating the communist. It is a statement of appeasing the communist. It is a statement of no win." So it was a no-win war. They weren't allowing them to fight to win, and they were continuing that policy of containment. So on the second column of page 425, under the picture of the map there, highlight the Tet Offensive. Highlight American and South Vietnamese troops. Highlight defeated them militarily. The liberal American media portrayed the Tet Offensive as a defeat. So defeat is the final word in the paragraph there. And that's what you'll want to know for this. Technically, the American and South Vietnamese troops won this offensive, but the media portrayed it as a devastating loss, and that was tragic for the troops there because it turned the American public greatly against them. And this was a time of, it was the hippie movement, protests against the war, draft dodgers were fleeing to Canada, and it was a terrible time. Morale was incredibly low. The country was suffering general inflation, and it was truly just kind of a mess. So under betrayals at home, highlight hundreds of anti-war protesters and communist-inspired agitators took to the streets of every major American city and college campuses. And they were denouncing American imperialism in East Asia. And what they were claiming here was that America was interfering in an attempt to gain an empire in Asia, which definitely was not entirely true. The goal here was to stop communism. It was just done in a very, very wrong way. Turning to page 426, highlight the date in bold, 1973, and highlight that a ceasefire agreement was finally signed. So in all, in this no-win war, over 58,000 American soldiers were killed, another more than 300,000 were wounded, and 780 were missing in action. Probably one of the worst parts, however, that was that hundreds of American prisoners of war were just left behind in the prison camps. And efforts to get them released were hampered and, in many cases, simply given up. And it was a true, horrific. And you'll see in a lot of places today that people still fly. They'll have the black POW flag. And that was, a lot of times it's flown in remembrance of those who were never released from these North Vietnamese prisons. Last thing to highlight on page 426, highlight that Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. So the U.S. troops fully pulled out of South Vietnam. North Vietnamese troops promptly violated the ceasefire agreement and took the rest of South Vietnam. And even though South Vietnam was entirely unprepared, they were short of military supplies, the U.S. had abandoned them, the South Vietnamese soldiers continued to fight with empty weapons. And it's a testament of just how desperate they were to avoid this communist takeover, that rather than surrendering, they were willing to lay down their lives with empty weapons in their hands. So by 1975, the communist flag flew over all of Vietnam. Right, on page 427, disarmament and détente. Highlight Edward Teller. Got a picture of him there. He was a Hungarian-born American physicist, and he worked on the Manhattan Project, which you should remember was the project that designed the atomic bomb. They now plan for a more powerful nuclear weapon, highlight the hydrogen bomb. A little farther down, highlight Teller again, and highlight that he became known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. And he was able to develop this in spite of opposition from a pro-communist, J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was a pro-communist there, honestly a bit of slightly traitorous in his actions because he was pro-communist. Never good to have someone like that in a position of power. Right, I'll let you read on your own about the campaign for disarmament. No highlights there. Turning to page 428, under the age of détente, highlight the term détente and highlight this means reducing of tension or hostility between nations. So it was a period of détente, trying to reduce tensions. So first there was a détente with China. You can see a picture there of Richard Nixon and Zhou Enlai in China in 1972. Highlight President Nixon and his Assistant for National Security Affairs, Henry Kissinger. They were able to end American opposition to Communist China's membership in the United Nations. Some people tout this as a step in the right direction and a step forward. Really, it was a negative thing. Remember that under communism, some 40 million plus Chinese people had died. Now, they were formally admitting China into the United Nations, a peacekeeping organization. Probably should not have happened. They acknowledged the communist government as China's true government, and they cut off Taiwan, even though Taiwan had been allies with the US government ever since the days of Chiang Kai-shek still being in power in China. Top of the next column, highlight Nikita Khrushchev and highlight that he was succeeded by Leonid Brezhnev. You want to know that. On page 429, highlight under the SALT treaties that the United States and Soviet Union agreed to the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, or SALT I, and highlight that this was limiting the production of nuclear arms. So you don't need to know the full name, you can just know the abbreviation SALT. So this was part of the détente with the Soviet Union, trying to reduce hostilities. There was a SALT II treaty further reducing nuclear weapon stockpiles. So unfortunately, the United States was cutting down their nuclear weapons, while the Soviet Union showed no intention of actually keeping those treaties, and they were continuing their production. And these were the days of President Carter. Easily ranks as one of the worst presidents. He also negotiated the surrender of the Panama Canal Zone to Panama, giving up that very strategic location, the canal that the United States had funded, protected, and run for nearly a century by the time it was handed over. And very dangerous because that canal is a vital link in both military and commercial interests. All right, that's the last of the highlights for today. Make sure that you thoroughly complete your reading, answer all of your homework questions, and let me know if there's anything you need or any questions that I can help you with.